Have you ever considered the possibility that there is something inside your home at this very moment that you cannot see? Not something frightening lurking in the shadows, and not the kind of mystery people talk about in horror stories. I'm talking about something far older than your house, older than your family history, and according to Christian tradition, something that has been connected to your life since the day you entered this world. Most people spend their entire lives unaware of it. They move through their days, raise families, face struggles, celebrate victories, and never stop to ask whether an unseen presence has been standing beside them all along. Today, I want to talk about three specific signs, not vague spiritual cliches, not comforting phrases that sound nice but explain nothing. I'm referring to signs that have been discussed, recorded, and examined throughout centuries of Catholic mystical tradition. These are signs described by saints, theologians, and individuals whose accounts have been preserved by the Church. Signs that, according to that tradition, can reveal whether the angels assigned by God are actively working within your home right now. And before you dismiss the idea, consider something. After years spent listening to stories, studying spiritual traditions, and examining countless accounts, one reality keeps appearing again and again. Many people assume their homes are spiritually protected simply because they believe they are. Yet protection and awareness are not always the same thing. In fact, most people would not recognize the presence of a guardian angel, even if that angel stood only a few feet away from them. That may sound surprising, but stay with me, because what we're about to explore could completely change the way you think about your home, your family, and your spiritual life. This conversation is important because it works in two directions. On one hand, it reveals what genuine spiritual protection looks like when it is truly present. On the other, it forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. If these signs are absent, what does that mean? Is it possible that many people are living without recognizing what they are missing? To understand the answer, we have to begin with a reality that modern culture often ignores. The world is far larger than what our senses can detect. Most people accept that statement when it comes to science. We know there are things beyond our immediate perception, but the tradition we're discussing goes even further. It claims that reality itself contains dimensions that cannot be measured with ordinary tools. According to Catholic teaching, the visible world exists alongside an invisible one, not as a symbol, not as poetry, not as mythology, as an actual reality. For more than 2,000 years, Christian teaching has maintained that human beings live surrounded by spiritual beings. Scripture, church councils, theologians, and saints all speak about this unseen dimension with remarkable consistency. They describe a world populated by intelligent spiritual creatures who are deeply involved in the unfolding story of human life. According to this understanding, what happens inside your home matters far more than you realize because the invisible world is paying attention. The angels described by this tradition are very different from the harmless images commonly found in greeting cards or decorative artwork. They are not portrayed as sentimental figures floating quietly above the clouds. They are presented as powerful spiritual beings whose existence began before the creation of the physical universe itself. When Scripture describes heavenly beings rejoicing at the foundation of the earth, it suggests that these creatures existed before the first moments of material creation. They are ancient beyond comprehension. Even more remarkable is the belief that God assigns particular angels to particular souls. This idea is not treated as a legend within Catholic theology. It is considered part of the Church's teaching. The Gospel of Matthew records Christ speaking about angels connected to human beings, angels who continually behold the face of God. Notice the significance of that word, continually, not occasionally, not only during moments of prayer, not only when life is going well, continually. According to this belief, your guardian angel has never ceased standing before God on your behalf. Whether you are aware of it or not, whether your life is peaceful or chaotic, whether your faith is strong or weak, that reality remains unchanged. Right now, as you listen to these words, the tradition would say that this relationship is still active. But here is where the discussion becomes especially important. The real question is not whether your guardian angel exists. The tradition assumes that answer is yes. The more important question is whether your life and your home have created the conditions that allow that angel's mission to operate freely. That distinction changes everything. This is a subject that many people avoid because it requires acknowledging that spiritual realities may function according to principles. If those principles are real, then actions have consequences. Habits matter. Choices matter. And not every household is spiritually identical simply because the people inside it consider themselves religious. When we examine the writings of individuals such as Padre Pio, Saint Gemma Galgani, Saint John Vianney, and many others whose lives have been carefully studied by the Church, a fascinating pattern appears. These saints did not describe angelic activity as something equally experienced everywhere. Instead, they described it as responsive. That word deserves attention, responsive. According to these accounts, the ability of a guardian angel to work effectively within a household is influenced by the spiritual condition of the people living there. The angel remains assigned to the soul, that never changes, but the degree to which its guidance, protection, and influence can be received appears to vary. This should not be understood as God withdrawing his care. That is not the point. Think of it another way. Imagine a fire. Give it fuel, oxygen, and the proper environment, and it burns brightly. Remove those things slowly over time, and the fire weakens. Its nature has not changed. Its potential remains. But the conditions surrounding it either support or restrict its strength. The saints often describe spiritual life in a similar way. The mission of a guardian angel remains constant, but the environment of a person's life can either encourage that mission or hinder it. Every choice contributes to the atmosphere in which that spiritual work takes place. Over time, I came to understand something that changed how I looked at spiritual struggles. For years, many discussions focused almost entirely on danger. What negative influences are present? What doors have been opened? What threats exist? Those questions matter. But eventually another question became equally important. Not what darkness has entered, but what light is being prevented from entering. Because sometimes the greatest problem is not the presence of evil. Sometimes it is the absence of what should have been present all along. There are homes where the activity of grace should be powerful, where spiritual support should be evident, where the influence of heaven should be deeply felt. Yet that influence has been drowned out by distraction, endless noise, constant entertainment, and the gradual disappearance of prayer. In such environments, the voice of the spiritual life becomes harder and harder to hear. And perhaps that is one of the greatest dangers of all. Direct attacks are not always necessary. Sometimes all that is required is enough distraction to keep people from noticing what they are losing. A family may still possess every spiritual gift available to them in principle, but if they no longer recognize those gifts, they live as though they do not exist. That reality brings us to the three signs. These are not extraordinary miracles reserved for saints or mystics. They are indicators that ordinary people can observe in ordinary homes. They are signs that suggest a genuine, active, and unobstructed spiritual presence. Their absence is not meant to condemn anyone. Instead, it serves as valuable information, a diagnosis pointing toward what may need attention. And the first sign begins with something so simple that many people overlook it completely, a peace that cannot be explained by circumstances alone. The first sign is a kind of peace that modern people often misunderstand because they immediately connect peace with comfort. But the peace we are talking about here is something entirely different. It is not the calm that comes from having enough money in the bank. It is not the temporary relief that appears when everyone in the family is getting along. It is not the satisfaction of a clean house, a successful week, or a life free from problems. Those things can certainly create pleasant feelings, but they are not what the spiritual tradition means when it speaks about peace. The peace described by the saints is deeper. It remains present even when circumstances become difficult. It survives financial pressure. It survives illness. It survives uncertainty. It survives the countless challenges that every family eventually faces. It is a stability that exists underneath the surface turmoil of life. Visitors sometimes notice it before the family itself does. They enter a home and sense something they cannot quite explain. Nothing dramatic. Nothing mystical in an obvious way. Just an atmosphere that feels different. A sense that despite the struggles present in the household, something solid is holding everything together. This is why Scripture refers the peace of God as something that surpasses understanding. It exceeds what circumstances alone can produce. It cannot be fully explained by external conditions because it does not originate from them. According to the tradition, it comes from living close to God and from the activity of spiritual realities that remain connected to His presence. The saints often described angels as carrying something of heaven's atmosphere wherever they fulfill their mission. This is not meant poetically. It is a theological claim. If angels exist in continual communion with God, then their presence naturally reflects something of that relationship. Their influence brings encouragement, courage, consolation, and a remarkable sense of inner steadiness. Even great theologians explored this idea. They argued that angels participate so fully in divine happiness that their activity has a secondary effect on those they serve. Not in the way God directly grants grace, but in a supportive way that strengthens the soul. The result is often an interior calm that remains surprisingly intact even when the world outside appears chaotic. Accounts associated with saints frequently contain descriptions of this phenomenon. People who spent time around deeply holy individuals often reported feeling unusually focused, recollected, and peaceful. They spoke of a sense that their minds became quieter and their hearts more settled. Many believed this was connected not only to the holiness of the saint, but also to the powerful angelic presence surrounding a life completely open to God. But why does this atmosphere seem stronger in some homes than others? That question leads directly to an important spiritual diagnosis. The guardian angel is always present. The tradition is clear about that. However, the ability of that angel's ministry to be fully received is another matter entirely. Two obstacles appear repeatedly in theological writings and spiritual experience: serious unrepented sin and the prolonged absence of prayer. This point requires careful explanation because misunderstandings are common. Serious sin does not cause a guardian angel to abandon the person entrusted to its care. The relationship remains. The mission remains. The angel continues to love and serve the soul assigned to it. However, serious sin creates a condition that interferes with the soul's ability to receive what God intends to give through that relationship. Theologians often describe this in terms of grace. When a person deliberately separates themselves from the life of grace through grave sin, they interrupt the normal flow of spiritual assistance that God desires for them. The problem is not divine rejection. The problem is disconnection. It resembles a lamp unplugged from its power source. The electricity remains available, but the connection has been interrupted. This is why confession occupies such an important place within Catholic spirituality. It restores what has been damaged. It reopens what has been closed. Again and again, saints and spiritual writers describe confession not merely as forgiveness, but as renewal. They speak of people experiencing a return of clarity, strength, and peace after sincere repentance. The second obstacle is more common and often less obvious. It is the gradual disappearance of prayer from daily life. Prayer is frequently reduced to requests made during emergencies. Many people pray when they are afraid, confused, or desperate. Yet the spiritual tradition views prayer as far more than occasional communication. Prayer is participation. It is the deliberate act of stepping into awareness of the spiritual world. When prayer disappears, a family may continue functioning normally on the surface. Work continues, school continues, entertainment continues, responsibility continue. Yet something important quietly fades from view. The household begins operating as though the invisible world is irrelevant, not because anyone consciously rejects it, but because nobody intentionally acknowledges it anymore. Over time, this creates a spiritual blindness. The guardian angel remains present, God remains active, grace remains available, but the family gradually loses the ability to perceive these realities. They stop recognizing the signs that once would have seemed obvious. As a result, the peace available to them goes unnoticed. The protection surrounding them goes unrecognized. The guidance being offered becomes difficult to hear. This is why the first sign matters so much. The question is not whether your life is perfect. The question is whether your home naturally returns to peace after disruption. Does it settle into trust, patience, and stability? Or does it constantly return to anxiety, agitation, frustration, and unrest? Every family experiences stress. Every household encounters conflict. No one lives free from difficulty. The issue is what remains underneath those temporary storms. What is the baseline condition of the home? If the answer is persistent uneasiness, constant tension, and a sense that something is always missing despite every attempt to fill the void through entertainment, possessions, or distraction, then that information deserves attention. It may be psychological, it may be emotional. But according to the spiritual tradition, it may also reveal something important about the condition of the household's interior life. The second sign is even more fascinating because it is often present without being recognized. In fact, many people experience it regularly and never consider where it might be coming from. This sign involves what we call conscience. Most people think of conscience as the uncomfortable feeling that arrives after doing something wrong. They view it primarily as guilt, but the traditional understanding is much richer than that. Conscience is not only corrective, it is preventative. A healthy conscience warns before a mistake is made. It creates hesitation before a harmful choice. It produces an inner sense that something is not right, even when a person cannot fully explain why. This anticipatory quality is one of the most important aspects of moral awareness. Instead of reacting after the damage is done, it alerts the soul beforehand. The Church's spiritual tradition frequently connects this process to the work of guardian angels, not because angels speak audibly in ordinary circumstances, but because they influence the intellect and the will in subtle ways. Theologians consistently emphasize that angelic communication is usually quiet. Most people never hear words. They do not receive dramatic visions. Instead, they experience thoughts, insights, concerns, and instincts that seem to rise naturally within their own minds. A person suddenly feels uncomfortable about a decision. They hesitate before entering a situation. They sense that a conversation, relationship, website, or opportunity may not be what it appears to be. Often they cannot fully explain the feeling. They simply know something is wrong. According to the saints, these moments should not always be dismissed. Of course, not every thought comes from an angel. Human psychology is complex. Emotions can be misleading. Fear can distort perception. Yet genuine spiritual promptings tend to share certain characteristics. They are calm rather than frantic, clear rather than confusing, persistent rather than impulsive. They direct a person toward truth, goodness, and God rather than toward selfishness or panic. When someone lives in a state of grace and remains attentive to the interior life, these promptings become easier to recognize. The conscience grows more sensitive. Moral awareness becomes sharper. The person begins detecting danger earlier than before. This is one of the most consistent signs of active angelic influence described throughout the spiritual tradition. People start pausing before making compromises they once accepted automatically. They feel caution before entering situations that appear harmless on the surface. They become aware of subtle dangers that previously escaped their notice. The saints repeatedly described this experience. They spoke about being guided not through extraordinary visions, but through steady interior movements that redirected their attention toward God and away from what threatened their spiritual well-being. And according to many of those saints, the tragedy is not that people lose these promptings. The tragedy is that they stop listening to them. One of the most sobering observations found throughout the spiritual tradition is that a person rarely loses their guardian angel's guidance all at once. What usually happens is much quieter. Over time, people become less responsive to the warnings they receive. The inner nudge is ignored. The uncomfortable feeling is pushed aside. The hesitation is overridden. A person knows something feels wrong, yet proceeds anyway. Then it happens again and again. Eventually, what was once a clear signal becomes background noise. This process resembles the way people become accustomed to any repeated stimulus. At first, it stands out. After enough exposure, it barely registers. The saints often describe spiritual deafness developing in exactly this way. The guardian angel continues offering guidance, but the individual has trained themselves not to pay attention. That is what makes this issue so serious. The danger is not that heaven stops communicating. The danger is that people stop listening. Every ignored warning slightly raises the threshold required for the next warning to be noticed. Every compromise makes the next compromise easier. Every dismissed prompting weakens sensitivity just a little more. Years later, many people find themselves unable to distinguish between what is genuinely good and what merely appears good on the surface. This gradual desensitization carries enormous consequences, especially in the world we live in today. Consider the environment confronting young people. Previous generations certainly faced moral challenges, but the speed, reach, and sophistication of modern influences are unprecedented. Content that once required effort to find is now available instantly. Ideas, ideologies, temptations, and distractions arrive continuously through devices that never leave a person's side. A teenager today can encounter more competing moral influences in a single week than previous generations might have faced in months. Messages about identity, purpose, relationships, truth, and morality flow constantly from screens, social media platforms, entertainment, and online communities. In such an environment, an active and sensitive conscience becomes indispensable. A child whose conscience remains healthy possesses an internal warning system. That child may not always understand why something feels wrong, but they feel the caution before the damage occurs. They hesitate, they question, they pause. Those moments can make an extraordinary difference. On the other hand, a child raised in an environment where prayer is absent, where spiritual life is rarely discussed, where conscience is treated as an inconvenience rather than a gift, may gradually lose access to that guidance. The warning system still exists, but it becomes weaker and weaker through lack of use. Imagine trying to navigate an unfamiliar wilderness with a compass that no longer functions properly. The terrain becomes far more dangerous, not because the path changed, but because the ability to recognize danger diminished. That is why the second sign of active angelic influence is so important. It is not perfection. It is not constant certainty. It is not fearfulness or excessive scrupulosity. In fact, genuine spiritual awareness is very different from unhealthy anxiety. The sign is a living conscience, a conscience that remains alert, a conscience that notices moral danger before it arrives, a conscience that reacts to subtle warnings and takes them seriously. So ask yourself a simple question. In your household, Do people pause before making important decisions? Do they pay attention when something feels spiritually wrong? Do your children ever come to you and say, I don't know why, but something about this doesn't seem right? If those experiences occur regularly, they may indicate a healthy spiritual sensitivity. They may suggest that the interior life is functioning as it should. But if every feeling of discomfort is immediately dismissed, if every hesitation is viewed as an obstacle to personal desire, if conscience is consistently ignored in favor of convenience, then a gap begins to develop. Guidance is still being offered, but fewer people are receiving it. And that brings us to the third sign. Of all three signs, this one is often the easiest to dismiss, and yet perhaps it's the most frequently reported by families who live deeply rooted spiritual lives. The third sign is a pattern of protection. Notice that I am not speaking primarily about dramatic miracles. Extraordinary events certainly exist within the church's historical record, but that is not what we are focusing on here. Instead, think about the ordinary events of life. A change of plans that unexpectedly prevents disaster, a delayed departure that later proves significant, a chance meeting that arrives at exactly the right moment, a conversation that interrupts a bad decision, a doctor's appointment scheduled almost casually that uncovers a serious issue early enough to address it, a phone call that comes when someone needs encouragement most. Taken individually, each event might be explained as coincidence. Most people would likely describe them that way. But something interesting happens when these experiences begin accumulating over many years. Families who maintain a strong prayer life often notice a recurring pattern. Looking back over time, they begin to see moments that seem connected, small interventions, unexpected protections, timely opportunities, doors closing when they desperately wanted them open, only to later realize the closure was a blessing. What initially appeared random begins forming a larger picture. The Catholic tradition has long associated these patterns with what theologians call particular providence. This refers to God's personal care for individual souls and the belief that guardian angels participate in carrying out that care. Again, this is not presented as superstition. It is rooted in centuries of theological reflection and scriptural interpretation. One of the clearest biblical examples appears in the book of Tobit. Throughout the story, the angel Raphael accompanies Tobias and his family. What makes the account so fascinating is that much of the guidance appears ordinary while it is happening. Only later does the full significance become clear. That is often how providence works. The pattern is usually visible only in hindsight. While events are unfolding, they seem ordinary. Only after looking back does a person begin recognizing connections they missed in the moment. A route was changed, a meeting occurred, a delay happened, a conversation took place. What seemed insignificant eventually reveals itself as part of something larger. This is one reason many people fail to notice angelic protection. They are searching for dramatic interventions while overlooking the quiet consistency of everyday guidance. The saints repeatedly emphasize that angels most often work behind the scenes. They influence circumstances subtly. They arrange opportunities. They protect in ways that rarely draw attention to themselves. The result is a pattern rather than a spectacle. And this leads to an important question. Are you paying enough attention to see the pattern? Because attention itself is a spiritual skill. Most people move through life at such speed that they rarely stop to reflect on what has happened. Days blur together, weeks disappear, months pass unnoticed. In that constant movement, countless moments of grace are forgotten. The spiritual tradition proposes a solution to this problem. It encourages the practice of daily reflection. At the end of each day, a person pauses and asks simple questions. Where did I encounter God today? Where was I protected? What happened that might have gone differently? Where did I receive guidance? Where did a door close that perhaps needed to close? Where did an unexpected blessing appear? This practice is often called the examen. Its purpose is not merely devotion. Its purpose is perception. It trains the soul to recognize what is already happening. The guardian angel's work does not begin when someone notices it. The work was already taking place. The difference is that awareness transforms how that work is experienced. Families who regularly engage in this kind of reflection often develop an entirely different perspective on life. They begin speaking openly about grace. They share moments of gratitude. They discuss experiences of protection. Children learn to recognize blessings rather than taking them for granted. Gradually, the pattern becomes easier to see. And once people begin recognizing the pattern, something profound changes. Difficulties still occur. Challenges remain. Suffering does not disappear. Yet those realities are viewed differently because they are no longer interpreted as isolated events. A family starts believing that God is actively involved in their story. Decisions are approached differently because they trust that guidance is available. Prayer changes because it no longer feels like speaking into emptiness. It becomes a genuine relationship with a God who remains present and active through circumstances, conscience, opportunities, and unseen assistance. This is the third sign, a consistent pattern of protection that becomes visible to those willing to pay attention. The real question is not whether that pattern exists. The real question is whether your family has developed the habit of seeing it. At this point, it is worth pausing and considering what all of this really means. The three signs we have discussed, a lasting peace, a sensitive conscience, and a recognizable pattern of protection, are not rare spiritual privileges reserved for saints living in monasteries or for a small group of exceptionally holy people. According to the tradition, these are meant to be ordinary features of a healthy Christian home. They are not extraordinary. They are normal. The surprising reality is that many people have forgotten that they are normal. Over time, modern culture has encouraged a version of faith that often remains confined to ideas, rituals, and moral principles while pushing the supernatural dimension into the background. People may still believe in God. They may attend church. They may identify strongly with their religious tradition. Yet the active presence of angels, the reality of spiritual warfare, the influence of grace, and the constant interaction between the visible and invisible worlds frequently become little more than abstract concepts. The result is a form of spirituality that acknowledges the supernatural in theory while rarely expecting it in practice. But the invisible world does not disappear simply because people stop paying attention to it. The angels do not cease their work because modern society finds discussions about them uncomfortable. Spiritual realities are not suspended because contemporary culture prefers explanations that exclude them. If anything, the battle continues exactly as it always has. The difference is that fewer people are prepared to recognize it. That reality has consequences. Over the years, countless stories have emerged from families who slowly drifted away from prayer, neglected the sacraments, and allowed spiritual practices to fade from daily life. Rarely does this happen through open rebellion. More often, it happens through distraction. Life becomes busy. Priorities shift. Prayer becomes occasional. Religious symbols disappear from the home. Faith remains part of personal identity, but no longer shapes everyday living. At first, nothing seems different. Months pass, then years. Eventually, however, many families begin noticing changes they cannot easily explain. Anxiety becomes more common. Relationships become strained. A sense of emptiness settles into the household. Spiritual enthusiasm fades. Faith begins feeling distant and disconnected from daily experience. The change rarely arrives dramatically. It emerges slowly, almost invisibly. That gradual decline is one reason it can be so difficult to recognize. When a problem develops over many years, people adapt to it. They assume the new normal is simply how life is supposed to feel. Then one day they find themselves wondering why peace seems absent, why prayer feels difficult, why family relationships feel fragile, why spiritual life appears dry and lifeless. The answer often points back to the same issue. Attention was withdrawn from the invisible world, but the invisible world continued operating regardless. This observation is not meant to produce guilt. It is meant to produce awareness. Because if decline is possible, restoration is possible as well. The encouraging message found throughout the spiritual tradition is that none of these losses are permanent. The guardian angel has not abandoned its mission. Grace has not disappeared. Protection has not ended. The resources needed for renewal remain available. The deeper question is whether people are willing to create the conditions that allow those gifts to flourish again. That question deserves honest reflection. Think about your own home, not the idealized version you wish existed, not the version visible on special occasions or during particularly good weeks. Think about ordinary life. Think about the atmosphere that characterizes daily living. Does your home naturally return to peace after conflict and difficulty? Is there a sense of stability beneath the challenges? Do the members of your household possess a living moral awareness? Are they attentive to the inner promptings that guide them away from harmful choices? Can you identify a pattern of protection and providence stretching across the years of your family's story? If the answer is yes, even imperfectly, then what you possess is valuable beyond measure. Such conditions should never be taken for granted. They should be protected, strengthened, and nurtured, because the pressures working against them have never been greater. But perhaps your answer is different. Perhaps one or more of those signs seems absent. Perhaps you are unsure how to evaluate your household at all. Perhaps life has become so noisy and fast-paced that you no longer know what spiritual health is supposed to look like. If that is the case, there is good news. Restoration is not complicated. Demanding, yes, but complicated, no. The first step is one that spiritual teachers have emphasized for centuries: reconciliation with God. Within Catholic tradition, This begins with confession. Many people view confession primarily as a way of dealing with guilt.